Well, I'd just like to begin by acknowledging the traditional owners of the land that I'm streaming to you from today, the Wurundjeri people of the Kulin Nation, and pay my respects to elders past and present. And I extend that respect to any Aboriginal Torres Strait Islander people joining us here today. Welcome to our first seminar series of the year. For seminar of the year, so the first part of our seminar series. Seminar series is a monthly event in which we invite experts in the forensic behavioural sciences and related fields like law and criminology to present the latest research that they're working on. Today, we're lucky enough to have Dr. Tyson Whiddon, who will be presenting findings from a large online survey of sexual feelings and behaviours towards children among men in Australia, the United Kingdom and the United States, a pioneering study. So I'm really looking forward to hearing what Tyson has to say. Before I throw to Tyson to present, I just want to let you know that, of course, I mean, you would know this. This is a seminar series that's held monthly, but if you want to be kind of made aware of upcoming seminars, please send an email to the address you see on your screen and you'll be added to our mailing list, so you'll never miss one of these great seminars. We have lots of really interesting kind of presenters lined up for this year. Next month, we have an economist, Steve Marchand, from the University of Melbourne, who will be presenting his findings on the effect of behavioural rehabilitation programs in prison. So that should be a really interesting one, both from a methodological perspective and obviously from a kind of policy perspective as well. Okay, our speaker today, let me give a brief introduction. Okay, so our speaker today is Dr. Tyson Whiddon. Dr. Whiddon is a Senior Research Fellow at Childlight at the University of New South Wales and also an adjunct lecturer at the University of New South Wales in the Department of Psychiatry and Mental Health. He was awarded his PhD in criminology from Griffith University, where he also completed his undergraduate degree. Tyson's research expertise spans criminology, public health and mental health, with a strong focus on using administrative and record linkage data to inform policy and program evaluations. Personally, I really enjoy Tyson's kind of methodological focus and his statistical expertise. He collaborates extensively with government agencies and non-profit organisations to evaluate criminal justice and public health programs that impact vulnerable young people. So if you can give a warm virtual welcome to Dr. Whiddon, that would be fantastic. Excellent. I can see some people have mastered the use of the clapping icon. Nice one. Okay, so a little bit of housekeeping quickly before I throw to Dr. Whiddon. First, this session is currently being recorded and will be made available on YouTube. So if you miss anything or you think a friend or family member would like to kind of see this presentation, it'll be available for all of you to see, and I'll let you know once that's out. We have made some time available for questions following Dr. Whiddon's seminar. So 10, 15 minutes or so. Feel free to ask questions throughout the seminar. You can do so by clicking on the Q&A tab, okay, at the top of your screen. Otherwise, by entering your questions in chat. We'll ask Dr. Whiddon those questions following the presentation, okay? So I'll go in on a first come, first serve basis. And that's about it. Tyson, Dr. Whiddon, I should say. I miss you. I can't see your camera. You're there? Fantastic. Please feel free to start sharing your slides.
Thank you very much, Ben. Okay, can you confirm? So can you all just see the slides? Everything's up and running? Perfect, excellent. All right, thank you, Ben, for the invitation and speaking so kindly about me. So yes, my name's Tyson, and today I'll be talking about the methods and kind of broad overview of findings from an online cross-country survey of men's sexual feelings and behaviours towards children. There we go. So what I'll be doing is giving a bit of a granular insight into the methods and some select findings from this study. Now, the study itself looks at various forms of sexual contact with children, but I'll be primarily focusing on technology-facilitated child sexual exploitation abuse, which throughout the slides I'll use the abbreviation TFCSEA. The study itself was funded by Westpac's Safer Children, Safer Communities program in 2022. And part of the reason why I'm presenting this is also because the study itself will be the basis of an upcoming special issue in the Journal of Interpersonal Violence. And much of what I'll be talking about, you can look in much more detail in the methods paper that will be released in that special issue down below. So just to give you a background as to the rationale for the study, summarize that. So current data on technology-facilitated child sexual exploitation and abuse, it has robust victimization surveys, but relatively little research has been done on perpetrators by comparison. Much of that research itself is dominated by studies based on forensic or small convenient samples. Little is known about offenders who operate undetected in the community. There are very few self-reported anonymous surveys of men who engage in these behaviors. Now, this is particularly an issue because most child sexual exploitation abuse perpetrators have no prior criminal records, and so they often also don't commit other crime types. They tend to be quite specialized in their offending. Now, this makes it incredibly difficult to reach this population, both from a research point of view and a prevention perspective. And alarmingly, perpetrators often seek out opportunities to offend, whether that be grooming children on social media, engaging single mothers on online dating sites, or seeking employment to gain access to children. Now, this last point is quite pertinent. It's something I'll talk a little bit about a bit more later, because in Australia and in the UK and US, working with children background checks predominantly rely on criminal history checks. And as we know, a lot of these offenders haven't been caught and don't have extensive criminal history. So there's the high possibility that a lot of undetected offenders are potentially working with children. That's it. Okay, so the study itself extends from previous community-based samples on perpetration, which are limited and largely limited to European samples. By looking at cross-country differences and incorporating a broader scope, so as opposed to just looking at feelings and behaviours and some routine demographic factors, our study covers a broad spectrum of demographic factors, health issues, physical, mental health, ACEs, social support, patterns of technology use, pornography use, attitudes regarding child's sexualization, and so on. So there were two attempts to the study. Yes, we did initially fail, and I'll tell you a bit more about that. Maybe fail is a strong word. So the study itself was originally created to survey around 3,000 Australian men from the general population. The survey was developed through our collaboration between the research team, which included myself, as well as a project advisory group, which included representatives from law enforcement, government agencies, mental health services, financial intelligence units. Now, the survey itself was intended to be originally uploaded to Qualtrics and administered by an online panel. Given such online platforms are quite well suited to survey sensitive topics where people would usually be reluctant to participate or respond honestly because it's online, it's anonymous, and it can't be traced back to the individual, be identified. The survey itself covers 8 broad domains. We have 13 items regarding demographic factors, which also includes stuff like sexual orientation, race, and the gender identity of previous sexual partners. Internet use, which includes 7 scales with 40 items, including the frequency of routine online activities, type of social media use, types of encrypted messaging platforms used, cryptocurrency ownership and use. We have physical and mental health, looking at anxiety, depression, substance abuse, and then social adversity, which includes the ACEs questionnaire by Felitti and colleagues, the 10-item questions with that, as well as the multidimensional scale of perceived social supports. So that measures their perceived social support with friends, family, and significant others. We then have 25 items adapted from Collins' Child Sexual Abuse Myth Scale, as well as 12 items relating to pornography consumption, such as frequency, if they accidentally or intentionally watch, bestiality, violent pornography, if they purchase legal adult content online, and so on. We look at sexual feelings and interests towards children, ages of sexual attraction, their concerns regarding their sexual feelings towards children, and also about their accidental and intentional viewership of child pornography, engagement and sexual contact with children, both online and offline, their motivations and interests to have sexual contact with children if they would not get caught, stuff like that. Also worth mentioning that we, this being a highly sensitive survey, we attempted to reduce social desirability bias through a number of methods. First of all, reiterating the anonymity of the participants, using neutral language, providing sliding scale. So it's not a binary yes, no, it tends to be on a 5-point Likert scale from disagree to agree. Importantly, there's also a pre-survey screener that filtered out low-quality participants by asking them a range of questions about their social desirability, their honesty, and also some trick questions to weed out any potential bots and AIs. So the research platform that we originally commissioned to run the survey, Dynatar, after receiving the final survey, gave it to the lawyers who said, no way in hell. The exact wording was that the survey was immoral. Now, Dynatar itself, I'm not quite sure why they were our first choice. They specialize in market research and business research, so I guess it would make sense that they kind of wouldn't want to condone such a sensitive survey. This brings us to attempt 2. So our second attempt was with Cloud Research, who agreed to take on the study, saw a survey, like, yep, sure, it's just what we usually do. Now, Cloud Research itself is an online research platform that has access to over 100 million research participants globally. So they agreed to recruit and administer the online survey at no additional cost. So using the Cloud Research platform, the survey was conducted through Prime Panels. Now, this is an aggregate of numerous market research platforms. I think it's just shy of 50, or maybe it's over 50, I'm not quite sure. It's a lot. So each of these own research platforms have their own opt-in participant pools, which are profiled on hundreds of variables. So this allowed us to send out targeted invitations based on select demographic profiles that we kind of matched with the target populations to try and make it representative of the distribution of adult males in the Australia, UK, and US. I forgot to mention, that Cloud Research also said, instead of surveying 3,000 Australian men, why don't you survey 1,500, aim to survey 1,500. Sorry, we count 1,500, but survey a bit less. And we can also add in a commensurate amount of UK and US male participants at no extra cost. So that's where the cross-country comparison comes in. It was kind of, we accidentally fell into this opportunity. So the sampling and participants. So the survey invitations were sent out in the last 2 months of 2022, based on stratified samples of men aged 18 years or over living in Australia, the UK, and the US. Now, the target sample size was 1,500 eligible participants, and this was based on the assumption that the response distribution of child sex offenders, so either online or offline, would be a level 5%, and that would include a 95% confidence interval for a margin of error of 1.1% in either direction, meaning that we've got a fairly accurate grouping for that proportion based on our assumptions. Now, because Prime Panels itself doesn't, it aggregates survey participants from multiple platforms, the total number of invitations sent out were not disclosed to us. I don't think there's any way that we could obtain it. We also, we know that participants were paid, but that amount was undisclosed to us, and I think it was at discretion of each of the market panels. The stratification categories themselves were also limited to the pre-survey participation data held by Cloud Research, and this included age, race, which was just for the US, residential region, income, and educational attainment. So we used a best effort target based on the 2021 census of the adult male populations, meaning that we weren't able to get precise quotas, but we did what we thought was enough given the time and the costs. Also, it's worth mentioning that participants were assigned a unique random ID. No personal identifying information was recorded. Cloud Research hosted the research, but they had no access to the surveys. Data was password protected. It's very, very secure and tight. So just one thing I want to mention as well is that our study itself focuses on men and not women. It doesn't include women in the participants, primarily because men are the majority of child sex exploitation abuse offenders. Research indicates that although while some females do offend, their offending patterns, their risk factors, their circumstances, motivations, and tactics substantially differ from their male counterparts. So we thought it best to focus on the men given their majority status. So almost 7,500 men consented to participate in the study. 6,500 actually completed the survey, and a bit over 1,500 were subsequently excluded for various reasons. The majority of whom were excluded because they failed the mid-survey attention check. So overall, 4,918 men were retained. For the Australian sample, we just have shy of 2,000 men, whereas for the UK and US, we have around 1,500 each. And it took the men on average around 15 minutes. Sorry, the median time was around 15 minutes. The minimum completion, I think the fastest was 5 minutes or 4 minutes and 4.9 minutes once we got rid of all the bogus responses. So because we used best ever certification, there were some disparities between the representativeness of the sample and of the population that we're trying to be representative of. So to counter this, also conducted interproportional fitting or raking, which is just a fancy way to say that we weighted the participants based on benchmark statistics from the 2021 censuses for age, household income, race, education, relationship status, and employment. Now, the census benchmarks were based on the oldest age possible for men only from what was available in the census data. So that was ages 15 and up for Australia, 16 and up for the UK, and 18 and up from US males. Now, one thing to mention is that when you weigh data in any circumstances, you'll often obtain outliers who have extreme weights in either one way or the other. So I truncated those weights to reduce their impact on the estimates that we would produce, so they wouldn't unduly impact the findings. So before the weighting was applied, there was about a 4% average absolute difference between the baseline demographic characteristics of our sample and that of the census. After weighting, that difference was reduced down to 1.1%. Now, here is a fairly convoluted table. I've simplified this table quite a bit from the actual publication to fit it on a single slide. I've collapsed race, relationship status, and age. But here you can see the demographic proportions between our sample and each of the samples across the 3 countries and that of the census. And you can see that there's pretty close in terms of proportions. I will just note that for the income variable, low income was standardized to US dollars. So low income was under 25, moderate income was between 25 to 100,000 US, and high income was over $100,000 US. And that income corresponds to the annual household income before tax. So it's also important to note that the survey itself defines children as anyone under the age of 18 years. And now this is consistent with how the UN Convention on the Rights of the Child defines children. Now the survey has some limitations given its length. We couldn't quite fit in whether or not, sorry, we couldn't quite fit in the exact ages of the participants and the young person at the time of the behaviors, other than if the participant was above or below the age of 18 years when they had sexual contact with someone under 18 years. We do recognize that there are variations in the legal age of consent between the jurisdictions examining the study, often between 16 and 18 years. That being said, the survey does include measures that are unambiguously illegal, while others may potentially capture some consensual behaviors. It's just worth mentioning that transmitting, accessing, and soliciting online sexual material of someone under age 18 years is illegal in all jurisdictions covered in this study. So it's pretty certain that our questions regarding those behaviors correspond to illegal behavior. So here I've just presented the proportions within the Australia, UK, and US samples. The bolded percentage refers to the actual proportion, and the grayed out proportions on either side refer to the bounds of the 99% confidence interval for that proportion. So in Australia, we see that 2.5% of Australian men, 2.9% of UK men, and 5.1% of US men indicated that they had deliberately viewed pornographic material containing people under the age of 18 years while they were an adult. We see lower proportions when it comes to webcamming or live streaming a young person in a sexual way, as well as for paying for online sexual interactions, images, or videos of a person under age 18 years. Now, when we combine those measures, so men who indicated to one or more of those questions, just under 5% of Australian and UK men had engaged in an illicit form of technology to facilitate child sexual exploitation and abuse, whereas almost 10% of US men had done the same. As I'll clarify a bit later, this is actually consistent with research on US men, well, on the US in general, that the US actually does have much higher rates of child sexual abuse compared to Australia, the UK, and other European countries as well. Here we have some examples of the sexual interest and motivation questions. 4.1% of Australian men, 5.2% of UK men, and 7.5% of US men said they would watch pornography containing people under the age of 18 years if they were sure they would not be caught. A similar proportion indicated they watch a webcam sex show of a person under the age of 18 years if they were offered and would not be caught. And 6.4%, 5.3%, and 9.4% of Australian, UK, and US men said they would very likely or definitely have sexual contact with a child between age 10 to 14 years if they were sure they would not be caught and they wouldn't get into trouble and they would not be found out. In terms of sexual contact with a child under 10 years, we see 4%, 3.4%, and 7.3%. So a bit of a reduction in that, which also coincides to hebephilia and pedophilia rates of men. So other measures which may be a little less, which may capture potential consensual behaviors, having had sex or sexual contact with a person under the age of 18 years while you yourself are over the age of 18 years. We actually have surprisingly small proportions of that, which again are quite consistent with the research. 3.2% in Australia, 4.8% from the UK, and 6% from the US. Men who have flirted or had sexual conversations online with the person under age 18 years, 4.3% in Australia, 3.7% in the UK, and 5.9% in the US. Now, men who are actually concerned about their sexual feelings towards children and wanted help for those feelings we saw just under 5% for Australia and the UK and almost 9% in the US. Again, this is corresponding with the rates of child sex offending in these countries as well. Now, just want to note that with the had sex or sexual contact with the person under age 18 years, around 70% of these men had also engaged in online child sex offending or indicated that they had sexual feelings towards children under age 16 years. So that could mean that 30% of these men engaged in consensual activities, or could mean that 30% of these men were one-time offenders. There's a variety of possibilities for what this means. Unfortunately, we can't really, tease it out given the constraints of the data. So we have all these proportions, these prevalences. We need to see how will these stack up with the actual published research. So I conducted a proportional meta-analysis using random effects because of the heterogeneity, the differences between the samples in the published research of men from non-clinical samples in terms of the prevalence of online child sexual exploitation and abuse, which included 5 studies, a pool of almost 17,000 men, offline sexual contact with children, which we measured using that sexual contact question. If they were sexually attracted to pubescent children, so aged 11 to 16 years. Now, we measured that through a variety of measures, including men's lowest ages of sexual attraction and sexual attraction to prepubescent children, so under 11 years. And yeah, so what we see here, the greenish teal bars are the Australian sample. The blue represent the UK. The orangey salmon is the US. And the yellow latticed bars are the proportions from the meta-analysis. I just want to note that the error bars for the meta-analysis, they're actually prediction intervals, not confidence intervals. So prediction intervals are kind of a way to they're broader than confidence intervals, and they're often used in meta-analyses to kind of predict the range of potential values in future studies. Now, what we see here is that the Australian and UK proportions pretty much line up quite well with the results of the meta-analysis. We see, particularly for rates of pedophilia in online child sex offending, that the US sample kind of is on the high end, which we would expect and we've seen, and the rates kind of exceed the prediction intervals for the for pedophilia. So it could mean a couple of things. It could mean that we have some random sampling error with the US, or what it could actually mean is that it's actually consistent with the research. Now, research on US men is quite rare. Much of the research, particularly on that based on the meta-analysis, is based on European samples. So I think there are only 2 studies published since 2010 that have looked at sexual interest in children among US men in non-clinical samples, and they've all found prevalence estimates of around 8 to 12%. So they're quite inflated by comparison. So although the US proportions exceed that of the pool proportions from the meta-analysis, they're quite consistent with the few studies that have been published. Now, there are various reasons as to why we see these cross-country differences. One potential is maybe the variations in how these nations track and surveil online child pornography, as well as the various socioeconomic policies that underpin them. Now, it's worth noting that in Australia and the UK, both countries mandate proactive child protection measures and timely removal of abuse material, while the US itself lacks an equivalent federal legislation. Each of the states within the US are kind of left to their own devices. And it's also worth mentioning that as of last year, I think it was last year and the year before, the US hosted more online child pornography content than any other country in the world. So there's that. All right. How are we doing for time? I don't have a watch on me. That's all right. Oh, wait, I can see it. 3:32. Excellent. So now I'm just going to present some select findings from the study. There's no real rhyme or reason as to why I've presented these. It's just, I guess, it's what we looked at, and it's what I kind of anticipated you may find most interesting. It's worth mentioning that what's covered here is just a speck of what's available in the data. There's a lot of data, and there's only one of me, and our team's quite small. So talk a bit about that later, though. So in terms of age, we see, so here we have the pooled proportions by age for all men from each of the three countries. The yellow bar are those who have not engaged in online perpetration. The red bar are those who have. What we see is that most perpetrators are around 25 to 44 years. They're not older, which is also quite consistent with empirical evidence showing that online perpetrators tend to be quite more tech literate, and we know tech literacy kind of is a bit lower in older ages. Now here, what I've done is I've also compared the proportion of men by age who have engaged in online perpetration compared to those who have only engaged in offline sexual contact with a child. And what we see is that about 1/3 of offline contact men are aged over 65 years or older. Now, this general pattern itself is also quite consistent with the extant research showing that online offenders tend to be quite younger than their offline offender counterparts. Offline offenders, typically, particularly the older ones, may generally offend against only a few children, those who are in close proximity to them, such as family members. So it's one of the potential reasons why we see that distinct age distribution. Now, here's the pool proportion again, going back to the full sample, 5,000 or so, comparing non-offenders to online offenders. Now, over 90% of men were heterosexual, yet you'll see that the proportion of heterosexual men doesn't quite align with the proportion of men who said they've had sex with men. This is actually a fairly common finding in the literature, particularly amongst child sex offenders who will identify as being heterosexual males, but have also either experimented or have sex with men, but it's not part of their formal identity. We also know that online perpetrators tend to, a greater proportion, are of a high income, have a bachelor's degree or higher, live in the city. Now, the one thing I actually wanted to emphasize is that almost half of the online perpetrators work in occupations involving contact with children. Now, when we flip it, it corresponds to 16.5% of men who work with children were perpetrators. So we have almost 800 men who work with children. Around 15% of those are perpetrators. We have about 300 men who are perpetrators, almost half of whom work with children. So this translates to perpetrators being around almost 5 times more likely to work with children. Again, this is a replicated finding in the literature showing that men who offend against children actively seek out opportunities to have contact with children. And working, in education or even religious fields tends to give them that contact advantage. Okay, 10 minutes. Another series of analysis we did was looking at the economic activities associated with online offenders. So we looked at 10 online economic activities and looked at which of them contributed to the greatest probability of offending, independent of their impact on each other and on other demographic factors. So these are the 10 online activities. And so what we have here is what's referred to as a density distribution of marginal effects. So the adjusted density distribution of marginal effects. So this tells us the unique contribution of each economic indicator net of demographic factors on the probability of online offending And the plot itself here shows the spread of those probabilities across the sample for each economic indicator activity. Now, these probabilities are relative to non-perpetrators as represented by the 0 and the dotted line, the vertical dotted line. The values on the right show the average marginal effect, which is really the average marginal probability of perpetration associated with each of these covariates. Now, what we see here is that being approached by a child selling sexual content online was associated with the highest probability of perpetration and of all other economic indicators and demographic factors. So in other words, the probability of being approached by a child selling sexual services online was 12% higher for perpetrators than non-perpetrators. The probability of purchasing sexually explicit webcams online of adult content is 8% higher for perpetrators than non-perpetrators. When we look at daily online gaming, daily online banking, everything from purchasing subscription content to online sexual content downwards, those marginal effects were non-significant. So it's really uses cryptocurrency for online purchases and up, they were significant, but 3%, it's not such a large probability. So being approached by children selling sexual services online and purchasing webcams tend to be fairly potent economic indicators, relatively speaking. Looking at adverse childhood experiences. So we looked at the prevalence of ACEs as well as cumulative ACEs amongst 3 non-overlapping categories. So men with no interest or perpetration online child sex offending, men who only have an interest only in it. So they indicated that they would if they were offered or if they were to get in trouble, but it hadn't actually perpetrated. And then we have the men who have actually perpetrated. And this is based on the 10 adverse child experiences based on Fleety's questionnaire. So here we're just looking again at the pool proportion of ACEs. What we see here is that men with interest only and non-offenders, they're fairly comparable, except when it comes to sexual abuse, whereas perpetrators, they have a much higher proportion of ACEs. Now, I just wanted to point out that sexual abuse was associated with an almost 8 times higher odds of perpetration and almost 2 times higher odds of interest only. Now, I point this out because it's actually seems to be fairly consistent with the sexual abuser hypothesis, which argues that for a variety of reasons, whether it be psychosocial, biosocial, learning mechanisms, and so on, that children, particularly boys who are sexually abused, are more likely to grow up and sexually abuse children. It could be through dysfunctional sexual development, learned behaviors, and so on. But it's quite a prominent hypothesis in the field. Now, when we look at the other adverse childhood experiences, we see the largest disparity in terms of domestic violence. Domestic violence itself was associated with a slightly greater than 5 times higher odds of perpetration. There was no significant difference. There was one for household incarceration, but it's a bit negligible between interest only and non-interest and perpetration. Now here we look at the actual number of ACEs or the cumulative ACEs for the interest only and the perpetration groups. And what we see here, so what this presents is the proportion of men who have interest only or perpetrate by the number of ACEs they have. And we see what appears to be a dose-response relationship between the number of ACEs and the likelihood of perpetration. Now, that being said, that association is not exactly linear. We see that compared to men with no ACEs, those who have 1 to 4 ACEs were about twice as likely to perpetrate, whereas those with 5 or more ACEs were around 7.5 times more likely to perpetrate. So if it comes to what this would indicate, at least at a preliminary level, is that any risk assessments or anything involved in predicting perpetration or to maybe use a ACE cutoff as 4 or more, maybe not. Okay, so I'm just cognizant of the time. Now, when modeling the combined effects of all the ACEs as well as other demographic factors, so the idea is to identify the unique contribution of each individual ACE, because ACEs often co-occur. When you look at it at a univariate level in isolation, it's difficult to ascertain whether one ACE contributes to the outcome or whether it's another. So that's why I ran this multivariate model. And interestingly, what we found is that sexual abuse consistently came out as the strongest ACE associated with perpetration. Now, it also came out for the interest-only group when the comparison were men with no sexual interest or perpetration. When the comparison group were men with interest only, perpetration was associated with a 2.5 times greater likelihood of having experienced emotional abuse and 2.1 times greater likelihood of having experienced sexual abuse. So again, consistent with that sexual abuse hypothesis, we're seeing childhood experiences of sexual abuse come out as the dominant adverse childhood experience among online perpetrators. And we also see, based on the cumulative odds of ACEs, each additional ACE increased the odds of perpetration by 1.33 times, so 33%, and interest only by roughly 30% in the multivariate analysis. Now, interaction effects were examined between the countries, but there were no significant interaction effects were found, indicating that these associations tend to be quite consistent, or are consistent across Australian, UK, and US men. Okay, so I've just shotgun blasted this on the page, some other random findings I thought would be interesting. Perpetrators are much more likely to be concerned about their sexual feelings towards children and want help for those feelings compared to non-perpetrators. We've got almost half compared to 3.4%. They're more likely to have friends who engage in online child sex offending, 41.3% versus 3.7%. Just bear in mind, these are crude figures. That 3.7% can also include men who have had sexual contact offline, have sexual feelings. So it's not a comparison between men who don't have sexual feelings in any perpetration. It's just those who don't perpetrate online. 1/3 intentionally watch bestiality compared to 3.3%. They've got higher rates of moderate to severe anxiety and depression. Sorry. And they're more likely to agree or strongly agree with statements like sexual images of a child online where it appears that they are happy and enjoying the activity cannot really be described as abusive. So more than half compared to 13%. Viewing sexual images or videos of children is bad only because society says it is, 48.5% versus 9.2%. And there is nothing wrong with sex dolls that look like children, 38.8% versus 5%. Bear in mind, these attitudinal items range on a Likert scale from strongly disagree to strongly agree. And so this is only, these proportions are only for those who have indicated agree or strongly agree. Michael Sito, I think it was Sito, in prior research has changed the cutoff from strongly disagree to disagree and higher. So there's various ways you could do this cutoff. I thought this was most appropriate. Okay, so as I said before, what I've covered is kind of just a fraction of the data. We would love it if anybody wants to use the data, if anybody wants to collaborate. Like this study was done 2 years ago. We're only now able to get it out with publications and whatnot, but there's just so much to do. What I've presented here is what we've done so far. The first 5, so identifying demographic internet use characteristics, all the way down to descriptive study of men who do and do not want help for the sexual feelings towards children. They will be appearing in the special issue. The next 3, the online economic activities, development and validation of a screening tool, the cohorts of having friends who offend. These are in, they're being finalized for other publications. The 3 topics in blue are things that we've presented, but it's kind of in the initial stages. The results are done, but if anybody wants to contribute on those, if it's interesting, we're more than happy to have you come and help us write it and do whatever. if you have any ideas that you would like to do with the study, let me know. I'm sure we can make it happen. Like I said, there's just so much there, and I'm pretty stretched thin as it is. So by all means, please collaborate. Thank you. That's my email if you want to contact me, and I'm more than happy to answer any questions you may have.
That was such a wonderful presentation, Tyson. Thank you so much. Really, really comprehensive. And I think even though the study was done 2 years ago, that's an incredible amount of work over that time period, particularly considering the size of your team. And I'm really looking forward to seeing what comes out next in this special issue that's upcoming. So thanks once again. Do we have any questions? Not I do. Here we go. Okay. Okay, first question. Will we get a copy of the slides? Maybe we'll leave that for offline. So yeah, well, I'll let you know. I had a question. Maybe while we wait, I had two actually. The first is one that it's kind of played on me a lot with this methodology generally, and I don't know how to kind of resolve it. But I do wonder about like the difficulty finding whether there's any challenges ensuring that the data is representative. So you're obviously going through marketing panels, and I presume the people that use marketing panels may differ systematically from the general population in terms of being more technologically literate and so on. And then I wonder, sorry, this will be multi-part. Then I wonder whether traditional survey methods are kind of now going by the wayside. So I don't even know if there's a way of overcoming that. And if you had any thoughts about kind of that issue.
Yeah, so no, you're absolutely right. People who do surveys online and sign up for those survey platforms, they tend to be younger, more technology adept, online more often. So those people aren't really representative of the populations that they are. That being said, given our part of our focus was to look at online child sex offenders, that population of men who are online I think be kind of more of our ideal target. There's no way in hell we could do the survey paper-based, face-to-face, based on a lot of the open-ended responses we got, calling us sick fucks, to put it mildly. There were quite a few people who were very pro death penalty for anybody who answered anything other than absolutely no to some of these questions. And quite interestingly, there were quite a few people justifying their responses, talking about, 12, 13-year-olds, particularly girls, can develop much more quickly, and it was almost like an opportunity for them to express their rationale for it. So yeah, yeah, it's the same with the Australian child maltreatment study, where that itself was based on phone-based surveys, and I think it was Homeline, landline phones. I don't know anyone who has a landline anymore. So again, this is just part of the parcel, and we just need to interpret the data within those limitations.
Yeah, it's certainly not a kind of. I don't think it's certainly not a criticism of the approach, because I don't think there really is a way around it going forward. As I understand it, the ABS has kind of declining kind of participation rates as well in their surveys, and they spend millions, of course.
It's also, in terms of practicality as well, the time it will cost to get a participant pool of this size. This was cheap. It cost us less than 20,000 to do the survey. We'll be lucky to get a couple of hundred for 20,000 if we did it paper-based.
Yeah.
So we've got that as well, the feasibility and the time. Now that being said, Cloud Research as well, they also market themselves as being able to capture the best quality participants and whatnot. So I guess we can, if we're quite charitable, we can take their word for it. But yeah,
sure. Okay, fantastic. Thank you very much. I won't hog all the question time. We have a question from Jane Reed. I hope I'm pronouncing that correctly. How much do you think the data includes age-appropriate relationships around the 18-year-old cutoff? I think that's in reference to that offline sexual contact
Yeah.
question.
Um, it's hard to know. I have my suspicion that at least, well, I doubt it would be more than 30%. Just based on the fact that 30% didn't have any other indicators of blatantly illegal contact with children, who indicated that question. When we also look at the age, the fact that around 1/3 of them were 65 years or older, again, it could be a 17-year-old. We're not sure. That's part of the reason why I kind of focused the presentation on the unambiguous, the definitely illegal items regarding online child sex abuse, and a lot of our research also revolves around that as well, unless it's a specific research question that we're quite interested in regarding offline contact.
On the offline contact question, I was just wondering, was it based on a lifetime period, lifetime activity?
No. So we asked them before or after they were 18.
But across, yeah, okay, right. Okay.
Yeah. But it's very possible that a third of those 65-year-olds are remembering 40 years ago.
Yeah,
it's possible. Yeah.
Yeah. Okay, got it. Okay. We have another question. Given you have this is from Madison Riachi. Given you have responses to open-ended questions, for example, rationalizing behavior, have you considered analyzing these?
Oh, the colleagues of the pie in the sky ideas want to. I'm a bit more iffy about that because the open-ended questions weren't compulsory, unlike all the other questions. So you're getting a bit of a skew as to the types of people who would respond to them. It's certainly interesting. And if somebody has the time to do it, I'm sure they can. But like I said, there's a lot there. There's only so much, but it's certainly something that my colleagues have raised more than once.
It sounds disturbing, getting a lot of those kind of responses.
It's no worse than what you see on Reddit.
I suppose that's true.
Yeah. Well, actually, some of them are, but internet's desensitized me.
And you haven't found like that hasn't spilled out outside of do they know the research team just out of interest?
No.
Okay, that's a relief.
So, there was our the university lawyers double check this. Once you receive an invitation to the survey, you're met with quite a detailed page regarding if you have any complaints, if you need support services, this is where you can contact. If you're angry, here, contact this person. We didn't receive any complaints. Another thing to point out, so with the question regarding if they were concerned about their feelings and they wanted help, participants who answered yes to that were also redirected to support links to relevant, I guess, support networks based on their country. There isn't really much, there's virtually no awareness and very little funding for support for those people, and so that itself is quite interesting. It's something worth looking at.
Yeah, absolutely. Do we have any other questions? No? Okay. Look, I'd like to once again thank you, Tyson, for your time. That was a wonderful presentation. So much to kind of think about. If everyone here again could give a virtual kind of round of applause for Dr. Whitten. Thank you very much for your time. And hopefully we can see you back, once more of these analyses are underway. I'd be really interested to see how it works out.
So we're planning to roll this out to a broader survey of Southeast Asian countries. It's part of
Oh,
the reason why Childlight was created at UNSW. So Childlight, if you just Google it, save me trying to butcher the explanation for what it is. Basically, it's this offshoot from Interpol and all this to create kind of research hubs that can inform practice and law enforcement efforts. So the UNSW Childlight, part of the impetus for its creation was to do this survey a little bit more refined, but in the Southeast Asian districts, so Thailand, um, PNG, all those areas, and so hopefully in 2 or 3 years' time, we'll
that's
have that.
interesting. Will you be trying to get kind of expats as well through
Yeah,
that, or is
so
it
that so
purely aimed at the?
UNICEF and who are on board. The Thailand's on board. All the countries on board. It's just the money. It's the money issue now. Yeah, so it's going to cost more than $20,000 to do this survey there. A lot of it will probably have to be in person, or we're going to have to figure that out as
Yeah,
well.
it's
But
challenging.
yeah,
Wow, fascinating. Great. Okay, wonderful. All right.
thank you for having me.
No, thank you. It's our absolute pleasure.